Welcome to Chives house, and do come in and look round. I think you're going to find it quite interesting. This is the main entrance corridor of the house, very narrow and has 9 doors leading into or leading out of it, surprisingly. When we first came here, which was 50 years ago, we bought this place as a business and ran a restaurant. But immediately we got here, we noticed that this whole floor had a lot of rot in it. And as we were going to have staff, and as the coats were going to be hung on hooks attached to these bars, we didn't want anybody to break their ankle, so it was one of the first things we had to have done. When the floor was taken up, the workman who was doing it came rushing to me out at the back and said, "Do come." And it was absolutely amazing. It was like a graveyard. There were dozens of sheep's jawbones. And it seems that workmen, why they deposited them all here under what was the hall floor, I don't know, but it seems that workmen had bought a boiled sheep's jawbone with them for their lunch. They had a lump of bread and they peeled the meat off the jawbone. Obviously, it was very cheap. But when Mr. Crode, who was in charge of the building firm, came up and looked at it, he said, "We can't touch it," and we had to get a specialist firm in because they were worried about anthrax. So that way, unfortunately, I couldn't keep one of those jawbones to show anybody. It was felt that it was dangerous. Of course, my wife saw it all, but she's not here now. But it does seem a remarkable story. Well, we've come in through the front door into what is the smallest of the 3 sitting rooms in this house. This one is also the room that is the most Georgianised. The original medieval building was built in 1294 and dendrochronology proves this. In 1815, when the Navy no longer required the number of boats that they'd had before because Napoleon had been defeated at Waterloo, somebody got hold of this long medieval building and broke it up into bijou residences for naval officers whose ships had been decommissioned. Now, you may wonder why naval officers would want to live in the High Street in Fareham, but the real reason was that at Kintyre House on the other side of the road, it was the official residence of the Admiral of the Dockyard, and he went down to Portsmouth every day by lighter from Fareham Creek. Well, if they lived here, they would be invited to his musical soirees, his whist drives and other events, and would meet more of their fellow officers on those social occasions than ever they would by living in Portsmouth. But when the developer got hold of this medieval building, he put on then what was a contemporary front. It's about a metre added to the medieval building, and one can see the front of the medieval building's main beam running right through the house in all the lower rooms. We're now in the part of the house that's number 15. Chives House has 2 street numbers, 15 and 16. They're numbered consecutively because the street is numbered up to the church and then back down again. Now, this is very unusual. This is just number 15. Above it, next to it, behind it is number 16. And it's thought that when these places were broken down into bijou residence for the officers who were no longer needed, this one was probably sold with income. In other words, this one room could be let as a shop. And of course, it's been a business for hundreds of years. We ourselves ran a restaurant here, and this room was one of the main parts of the restaurant. But since we've closed in the year 2000, when we retired and got change of usage, all the restaurant rooms have been added to the domestic quarters. So I now have ended up with a house with 14 rooms. Here you can see where the Georgians put the modernisation bit on, probably a bit less than a metre. This was the main beam of the medieval front, and it was supported in 1815 by the new modern exciting material cast iron, which this pillar is. I'm now in the very heart of the house, which is much admired architecturally. It's where 4 staircases meet and a couple of corridors. This was originally the merchant's, because this is a merchant's house, his solar parlour, where he carried out all his financial transactions, and it was to impress people who he was paying or receiving money from. The staircase would not have been as it is now, it would have been a ladder staircase. All this part of the staircase dates from 1688. Of course, the wool trade brought quite a lot of money into Fareham. The raw wool was exported to Flanders, turned into fabric and tapestries, bedspreads, things like that, and re-imported by the British. And these people who were dealing with that made a great deal of money out of it, so they probably could afford to have these staircases put in, which were expensive in their day, and all the pillars were probably turned here on a simple hand-driven lathe, and they're all slightly different. You can see noticeably that some of them have got a very short base, but nothing was thrown away, it was always used. This interesting trout was caught by my father-in-law, and he took it to the taxidermist in Winchester, which was in the square near the cathedral, and had it stuffed because it's such an amazing size for a brown trout. Also, it stands on the oldest piece of furniture in the house, which is a coffer from the late 13th century. Now, this is quite interesting here on from this staircase. In 1997, dendrochronology was done and also carbon dating, and a bore was taken out of a beam on each floor in the house. And actually here you can see where it was filled in with a piece of dowel. This forensically proved the date of 1294, so there's no doubt about it. But it seems amazing that these beams, this house, this whole place has stood for 700 years, and probably there have been 28 to 30 generations of people living, moving, breathing, eating in it. I'm now in the main sitting room. There are 3 reception rooms in this house, but this one, which is a dining room cum sitting room, is the one that's most used. It's a very interesting feature just as soon as you walk in, because behind this part of the wall is the priest hole, which is reached between 2 joists in the attic. This wall goes back this far, and we will see in a minute in the kitchen the corresponding wall does not reach back as far, and it's there in this piece that one finds the priest hole. We'd been here 9 years. It seems unbelievable that we could be that simple. 9 years before we discovered this discrepancy between the 2 walls. This is the corresponding wall to the one in the sitting dining room. As you can see, it doesn't go back as far as the wall does to the sitting room door, and leaves a space of about 1 metre by about 2 metres. plenty enough to be able to lay down and sleep. This kitchen was added in 1972. It was converted from a cupboard, and it is really to service this main dining room. And now we come to an interesting feature, and I think there's very few of them that remain. This is a wig cupboard, and you can see the shelves going round it. You can also see all the rubbish that's in there, and you know, it's very untidy, but of course I live here and so I use everything. The shelves carried wooden heads upon which the wigs were placed, and they were put in that cupboard so that they could be re-whitened. Somebody stood on a stool, leant in and re-whitened them with a powder, and the powder was made from arsenic and iris root. And of course it didn't do the people who did the repowdering much good, but the idea of the cupboard was that it kept the dust, the white dust, from settling around the room. Good afternoon, Chives house. Yes, oh yes, it's lovely to hear from you. It's slightly inconvenient because I've got somebody here, so is it alright with you if I phone you back in about 20 minutes? Sorry about that. Oh, okay, well that's what I'll do. Bye. This is considered quite important by the inspector from English Heritage. He described it as pre-Adam, this fire surround. I'm not quite sure what that means or how it dates it. Also interestingly, here on these panels are original William Morris tiles. So the whole thing is rather nice. And above it is a portrait of my late wife. Well, now I'm sitting in what we call the library, and we can call it a library because there's so many books in here. And I often pass quite a bit of time in here because when Wikipedia lets me down, I usually can find the thing that I'm referring to in amongst one of these books. So I'm not too keen on the digital world and not having books about. Also, it's very interesting, we're not at the top of the house, we're on a mezzanine. As I've said before, there are no two rooms on the same floor, and this one contains some very interesting things. There's a flap there that when it's lifted down one can see the medieval roof from 1294, which the Georgians preserved by throwing another roof over the top rather than repairing it. And over here where water came in and some of the plaster fell off the wall, you'll see in a minute when I open it that there's the wattle for the wattle and daub that the majority of the inner sections of the house was constructed of. We're now out on the parapet from the second floor, but really the third floor, and the street looks entirely different from up here, and in the far distance down there you can see the outline of the hills on the Isle of Wight. This is a large room on the fourth level of accommodation at the very top of the house. Probably one could describe it as an attic room. And we're up here now so that I can just say I really have tried to be the caretaker of this building. I've lived here for 50 years and people have said to me how fortunate you are to have a home like this. But in some ways I think that the boot is on the other foot. I think the building is very fortunate to have had me looking after it, especially when one looks at some of the other grade 2 and grade 2 star listed buildings in the street. which seem to have fallen into, one could almost say, disrepair, because things have not been attended to at the start when they should have done. With buildings this age, the old saying, "a stitch in time saves nine," is really true. So this really is the conclusion of the programme, and I just want to say that I've been very pleased to be able to live here for this length of time.